All right, 8 o'clock. You seem a little light today. Game was too much last night. Rough. Rough. But I bet it's going to be better than the Sunday night game. That's all I can say. All right. Attendance quiz went live. Again, don't try to start it until you get the answers for today. We have a quiz that's due tonight, I believe. So don't forget about that. You've got 3 attempts. Lab next week. Handouts posted. Read through it, and you can decide if you're going to print out all of the pages, or just maybe the homework page, because maybe you have a tablet and you're going to do your answers in there. Again, that's perfectly fine. We only collect the one sheet. And don't forget that the homework from the data in ecology lab is due next week in lab. A hard copy, have your figure, have the answers to those questions. Make sure you bring them to class. Other than asked to share lists, vaccine incentive program. ASU is encouraging everyone to get vaccinated. All right, the second dose of the vaccine clinic is this week, right? Wednesday, Thursday, Friday. So if you participated before classes started, here's your chance to get that second dose, or maybe it was that first week of classes. But you have this incentive program. You can show your vaccine card to be entered into a drawing. And how many of you actually read the email? Those are actually pretty good prizes. I wish it would have just been across the board. If you get it, this is what if you did the vaccine, this is what you get, but it's a drawing. Unfortunately, what do you have a chance to win? There are 3 golden parking passes. Basically, park anywhere on campus. $2 $500 scholarships to the bookstore. Free housing for the spring semester. I think that's it. That's worth it. iPad mini, and then $100 ASU bookstore gift cards. That may get you like an ASU hat for $100. Much better than what they are offering the faculty. But in case you just ignored it, I just wanted to make you aware of it. Maybe you're vaccinated. If you're not, I encourage you to do so. But you don't have to share your card. You don't have to share your card. So just making that known. All right. All right. This is where we left off. The law of tolerance. So first off, does anyone have any questions from last week's material? If you have questions about the exam or the quiz, feel free to email me. I might not give you the answer. And there's always a chance that I messed up the key, so I do go back and check the key, check to see what I selected. Just know that I'm not going to provide the answer until after the due date, and then we can talk about why something is right or why something's wrong. But anyways, this is where we left off. Law of tolerance. Victor Shelford came up with this idea that basically explained why organisms can't live everywhere. And it's tied to their tolerance zone, their range of tolerance. What is the range of the abiotic factors that organism can live in and survive? All right, so we have this figure. You have the physical factor on the x-axis. Along this range, you have some areas where the organism does great. Their population size is great. This is really ideal situations for them. We call that the optimal zone. There are places where they don't do so hot. All right, they can survive, but the population doesn't really thrive because they're outside of that optimal zone. And we call this zone the stress zone. All right, organisms under stress. Can they survive? Yes. Are they going to thrive? No, they're not. But then you also have these zones where you basically have an upper and lower bounds where that organism, if we're outside of those bonds, they can't survive at all. All right, so in those zones, you don't find the individual, you don't find the population. We call those zones the zone of intolerance. They can't tolerate their conditions, they can't adapt to their conditions at that time. So you don't find them, they can't survive. That doesn't mean that it's immediate death as soon as they enter that zone. It's just that in those populations, they're not going to reproduce. You won't see any populations there. You might see the individual moving through the area, but that's not their habitat. And we said it's between those zones, that upper and lower bound, that's where we have our tolerance zones. So know the figure, be able to replicate it, be able to identify the different zones on this figure. All right? It's important to understand what all of this means. All right? So the curves themselves will vary based on the organism. All right? And they're going to vary based on the organism that we're interested in. And that means that every organism is different. And we should know that. I mean, that should be somewhat intuitive. You go into a habitat, you find some organisms there, you might not find the other species there, and so forth. All right, so the shape of this curve, the narrowness, the wideness, where it is on that axis scale is going to vary. And what we could do is kind of break it down into two different groups. We have our regulators and we have our conformers. All right, so our regulators maintain internal conditions within a narrow range. Give you time to get that up. Regulators will maintain their internal conditions within a narrow range. These regulators have some form of homeostasis. And homeostasis consists of the regulatory mechanisms that maintain those physiological parameters within specific limits. So a regulator takes part in homeostasis to maintain their internal conditions within this very well-defined range. All right, an example are the homeotherms, and you've probably seen this. All right, homeotherms are those organisms whose body temperature is regulated within narrow limits. Who can give me an example of a homeotherm? Anybody? Yeah, we are, right? We maintain our body temperature within a narrow range. What is that range? About 98. I mean, every individual is different. Some individuals' normal body temperatures, let's say 97.4, 97.6. Some normal temperatures is 98.6, 98.8. All right? But the point being is that we go out into the high 90-degree heat later today when the sun is blasting, and our homeostatic mechanisms will work to try to maintain our body temperature around 98 degrees. Come this winter, at the start of the spring semester, you're gonna walk outside. It'll be maybe 30 degrees, 35 degrees. Our homeostatic mechanisms will be operating to maintain our temperatures at that 98 degrees. All right, so what I'm gonna do is kind of give you a graph of a homeotherm to kind of illustrate this idea. All right, so we have our ambient temperature. T is ambient temperature. That's our environmental temperature. temperature of the body. That's our internal temperature. All right, and this will be an example of our homeotherm. All right. Now what we see is that there's a range of temperatures, upper and lower bounds, where we can maintain our body temperature. That's across the range. So our upper and lower bounds. There's our lower bound, there's the upper bound. This range is our zone of tolerance. So these ranges define where we can survive. Outside of those zones, we can't operate. Homeostasis can't work. So if we're up at the upper end, our body temperature goes up until we die. Down at the lower end, our body temperature goes down until we die. Now, this is in contrast to a conformer. Since we're talking about temperature, we'll talk about the equivalent, or the opposite of a homeotherm, which is a poikilotherm. Poikilotherm. And again, you probably learned it in grade school as like warm-blooded and cold-blooded. Tell you, I've already had this conversation with my kids. Those are not proper terms, all right? What they really want to talk about are these homeotherms and poikilotherms. Can you regulate your internal temperature physiologically, or do you allow your temperature to change with the temperature? So again, with our poikilotherms, we also have this range where they can survive, all right? But they allow their body temperature to fluctuate with that of the environment. So as the temperature goes up, so does their body temperature. In these organisms, they're not regulating it. They're just letting it change themselves. They're conforming to their environment. Outside of those zones, well, they can't tolerate it anymore. Maybe it gets too hot for their internal conditions, enzymes start breaking down, metabolic processes stop, and those guys die. At the bottom end, maybe they just freeze, all right? But again, we have that zone where our organism can tolerate those temperatures. Questions? And again, this is all individualistic. All right? When dealing with our law of tolerance. I think I'm going to get that here. Yep. Here's our physical factor. Population size. Right? We draw it as a bell curve. But it doesn't just have to be there. We can have a very narrow range. We can have a range that looks wide and it's shifted. We can have like an extremely narrow range, extremely wide range, or you can have something that's kind of very fixed but broad. So you've got this really narrow stress zone. The really narrow range where they get to that, they better get out because they're not going to do so hot. And if it goes down or above a certain level, that's it. But this curve, these curves affect our zone of tolerance and where they can live. So our thermophiles, those that love the high temperatures, our range is probably going to be much higher than those individuals that prefer much colder regions. Some individuals, some species have very broad range, zones of tolerance. Some are very short. Questions on those? All right, so our curves vary based on the organism, and when we give examples of these conformers and regulators, kind of relate their temperature to our law of tolerance graphs. And again, this varies based on the organism itself, and our population consists of multiple organisms of the same species. So you can't just think of a species having fixed zones of tolerance. It actually varies by the individual, and that's important because that variation allows our species to survive in a changing environment. All right, so if our population finds itself in a slightly warmer temperature, there may be individuals whose tolerance zone of tolerance, maybe even their optimal zone is in that range. And now your population could evolve to favor that range, to be optimal in that new temperature limit. Same thing if it goes colder. Or we're using temperature, it could be salinity, it could be pH, it could be any other physical factor that's out there. All right, so our tolerance limits may shift. They may shift along our axes, they may become wider, they may become narrower. That's the process of selection. All right, that's the process of selection. Questions on our law of tolerance? We bring this up, we introduce the law of tolerance because we recognize that the environment will vary. It changes both temporally, so through time, and spatially. So standing here is going to be different than standing here. And I can already tell, I can feel the air movement in this location. Some of our variation is predictable. Seasonality, that's a predictable change. We know it's going to increase, temperatures increase in the summer, drops off in the winter. Some of the variation is unpredictable. We have no idea if it's going to rain today. Not even the weathermen know if it's going to rain today. Especially here in San Angelo. Weatherman predicts it's going to rain. Hey, we have a dome. If that rain cloud develops in the dome, we get rain. If not, it goes around us, right? Good joke. Gotta laugh. It's Friday. Friday. All right. So this process, this variability, how it's variable, temporal versus spatially, and predictable versus unpredictable, really determines the ease of adaptation of our species. All right. How easy will it be for our species to adapt and to evolve? So just in brief summary, and we'll talk about this more in some detail, it is easier to adapt to harsh conditions that are constant. All right, so if it's always harsh conditions, or where you always have that same selection pressure, it's easier for our organism to adapt. Now that constant conditions applies both temporally and spatially. So, if we're dealing with, we'll use yeast. Yeast are a great evolutionary organism, model organism. Their generation time is short, where you can raise up hundreds of generations over the period of months. All right, and then you can you can save them, you can freeze them. So you can look at generation 100 and compare it to generation 0 and to your parental generation very easily, because you can store. So if we're trying to adapt yeast to high temperatures, we'll say brewing yeast. We're trying to adapt them to the temperatures that we get down here in Texas. We just make sure we set our temperature and keep it warm as they're reproducing, as they are replicating, as they are moving through time, that's going to be an easier change for them than if we set up the temperature where some days it's hot, some days it's cold. All right, so that's our constant temporal change. What about the constant spatial change? Well, this is homogeneous landscapes. That's what we're talking about. Because we recognize that a lot of organisms can move. Maybe not plants. I mean, plants, if you think about it, their seeds can move. So the offspring can end up in a different location from the parents. But for a homogeneous landscape, we need it so that the selection pressures are going to be the same no matter where our organism travels or where our plant germinates. All right? Harsh, constant conditions, harsh, homogeneous landscapes that produce these constant conditions. Those are going to be the ones that are easiest to adapt to. It will be hard to adapt to unpredictable conditions and landscapes. So we talked about temporal variation. If it's warm today but cold tomorrow, hey, that's going to throw off the yeast. The yeast might start adapting to the warmer conditions today, but as soon as they change, they're going to revert back to the cooler conditions of tomorrow. So in the end, we probably don't see a whole lot of change. That's even more complicated when we talk about organisms whose generation times are longer. So over the course of their life, they're experiencing multiple environmental types, multiple selection factors. It's hard to adapt to that. Same thing in terms of plants or animals that move around. If they're in one location with one set of selection pressures today, and then they move to a different set of selection pressures tomorrow, it's going to be very hard to adapt to those conditions. So you might ask, organisms persist in these changing environments. How do they do it? Well, the short answer is that the organisms will balance their fitness in all the types of environments. So they might not be optimal in any of those environments, but they're going to be good enough to that where they can survive no matter where they go. That's the overriding theory at that point. Don't know if yep. All right. You ready to move on? Before we move on, because I have an example of this. Our quiz today asks, what are the correct letters? You've got 8 choices. All right. Your first answer is the letter A. Write it down. Write it down, make sure you have it. For those that are watching at home, letter A is one of the answers. A is an apple. All right. All right, so let's go over an example. This is a great example because we'll talk about habitat heterogeneity in lab when we talk about why certain populations are distributed across the landscape. One of the reasons could be that they are just following the good conditions. So we've got these 2 habitats, habitat A and habitat B. Habitat A is very homogeneous. If we go ahead and plant seeds all across the landscape, all of those seeds, when they germinate, will start experiencing the exact same environment. Contrast that with habitat B. If we plant seeds all across this landscape, some of them experience the environment just like habitat A, but then other individuals will experience a different habitat type, right? Different selection pressures. This is a constant environment. This is a heterogeneous environment, non-homogeneous, you can say, non-constant environment. All right, so if we're looking at evolution and these selection pressures, our species will be able to adapt much more quickly and have an easier time at adapting in this constant environment, in habitat A. All All right, we'll see a fast rate of change because all individuals see it. All individuals see it, and their offspring, each offspring, or the offspring of each of those individuals will also see it. In habitat B, we're going to see a slow rate of change. It's going to be hard for our organisms to adapt because those individuals in the clear habitat, that like habitat A, will start to go down one evolutionary path. Those in this bluish habitat will go down a separate evolutionary path, and the offspring of all these individuals may remain in the same habitat as their parents, or they may go out to this other habitat. So you've got this, two forces that are kind of pulling our species in opposite directions, and they could, which makes evolutionary adaptation hard. So what would be the end result in these habitats? Well, in habitat A, since we have a constant environment, since all of our individuals experience the same type of environment, we are likely to see a single adaptation evolve and become most common in our population. All right? Our offspring, they see the same thing. They get that adaptation, and it gives them a higher fitness. They're going to pass it on to their offspring, who then pass it on to their offspring, and so forth. In habitat B, you probably won't see a single adaptation because what is good in the clear habitat might not be good in the blue habitat. So what we generally see is this balance of adaptations. You might see frequencies. So a certain portion has the adaptation that does well in A. You may have a certain frequency that with the adaptation that does well in the blue habitat. All right? Or you can have an intermediate phenotype. Again, that would be a single adaptation, but it's an intermediate phenotype. It's not the best for the clear environment, and it's not the best for the blue environment, but it allows our organism to survive no matter where it ends up. Yep. One is fast because it's a constant selection pressure. And we're going to assume that this is a harsh type of selection pressure. Say everything that the population experiences here, it doesn't matter where you're at, or it doesn't matter through time, what point in time, we're experiencing the same environment. So if we see the same environment, we see it, our offspring see it, our grandchildren see it. If we have the adaptation that does well, it'll very quickly increase in our frequency. Compare that to habitat B. We could see it, but our offspring may see something different. So while the selection pressure on us is to produce, let's say, this adaptation over here, our offspring's, the selection pressure on our offspring is favoring something like this, and it can go back and forth and back and forth and back and forth. It's just that that variation is unpredictable and non-constant. All right? So what type of responses are we going to see in these when our environment changes? And that's going to be the thing. We're in, let's say, I'm going to go back to this graph. We're in habitat B. We're in this region right down here. Let's see. We are right there. And then, all of a sudden, we move, get up and move, and now we are in this area. Let's fill that in. What do we do? What happens? What's the response that will be exhibited by our species? There's going to be two broad categories of response. And some of this response kind of depends a bit on our generation time. Because if our generation times, say 18 years, average age when first child's born maybe 20 years, right? What happens, our temperature tomorrow, our environment tomorrow is going to change. So we're not evolutions won't really act on us. But for a yeast whose generation time could be an hour, could be 3 hours, all right, that represents a pretty long, pretty fast change that's going to persist over several generations. So the categories of response that we see will either be an avoidance strategy, so avoid the harsh condition, move out of it, get to a different location, or an evolutionary response. So develop an adaptation, or if you have that adaptation, increase its frequency in our population. And this adaptation then should allow our organism to shift its tolerance limits to better match the environment that they are currently facing or currently experiencing. All right, so we're going to talk about these two broad categories, the avoidance strategies and the adaptation strategies in response to various types of selection pressure. So temperature, water stress, salinity, and so forth. We'll talk about those and talk about avoidance versus the adaptation. But before we get to that, we have to remember a couple of key ideas related to our evolutionary response. All right? There's like really key ideas that you need to remember moving forward. All right, so idea number one is that evolutionary trade-offs exist. And I know in my lab that first week I talked about trade-offs, and it's hugely important all throughout ecology, all throughout evolution. All right, so what does it mean by evolutionary trade-offs? Well, it means that every adaptation has a cost, and every adaptation has a benefit to it. And evolution, as to whether or not we keep the adaptation and spread it, will depend on that balance. If the benefit exceeds the cost, selection will favor it. If the cost exceeds the benefit, selection will take it out. All right, so sometimes, like here, in this Goldie's bird of paradise, you have this long tail. Well, there's a cost and there's a benefit to having that long tail. Anyone know the benefit of this? Yeah, so this is used in selection, sexual selection, mate finding. So yeah, bigger the tail, the more flamboyant that tail, the easier it is to acquire a mate. That's our benefit. Because, hey, if you want to survive, it's not just about surviving. It's about finding a mate and reproducing and leaving offspring. It's the only thing that evolution cares about, or that fitness cares about. What's the cost of this? What's that? Taxing on the body to carry, right? What's it going to affect? It's going to affect flight. It's going to affect movement. All right? That movement and flight, that's a primary escape strategy. Escape strategy from predators. So if you have a hindrance, you're going to be easier to be captured. That's a pretty big cost, because if you get caught by that predator, that's it. You're eaten. You are making offspring, but you're making offspring for the predator. All right, that's their energy source. So you could say, well, that's a pretty big negative. Why do they have these things? Well, again, cost-benefit analysis. The benefit of finding that mate and reproducing well exceeds the cost of carrying it and have a hindrance in their escape response. All right, so with our evolutionary trade-off, cost-benefit analysis, we consider that. The other part of this evolutionary trade-off relates to the principle of allocation. All right, the principle of allocation says that an adaptation to one selective factor may preclude or reduce adaptations to others. All right, so the easiest way to think about this principle of allocation is that if we're going to adapt and evolve to a very high temperature, to living in 115, 120 degree heat, we're probably not going to be adapted to living in the -20, -40 degree heat or cold, right? That's the principle of allocation. We've adapted to high temperatures at the cost of surviving in low temperatures. For this Goldie's bird of paradise, you can say, we've adapted to these long feathers, all right? And because we did that, it's going to be harder for us to evolve escape mechanisms. All right, because an escape mechanism may actually be smaller tails, give you more ability to maneuver between the limbs and the branches and so forth. All right, so evolutionary trade-offs, that's going to dominate. But we also have to consider the constraints. All right, and the constraints go back to everything that we talked about with the constraints. We finished that up on Wednesday? Is that when we finished it, or was that all last week? But the constraints on evolution, so, timing, where are we? The laws of physics and so forth. All right, all of those still exist. So because these exist, we might not be able to evolve the adaptation to every possible condition. All right, we might not be able to survive in 120 degree heat. Maybe that's our upper limit. We're constrained to, let's say, 100 degree heat. All right, it's not because we can't adapt it, but we're just limited. Laws of physics prevent that. So those two key ideas, remember these as we go forward. Questions? No? All right. Let us move on. So we just finished the introduction to adaptations. I will get the quiz posted after class. Let me give you an estimated due date once I open up the second one. Yeah, we will probably make the due date Monday evening. We'll probably do it Monday evening. Again, 11:30 at night, so you can start to review it. Because this avoidance strategies isn't very long. We'll probably finish, we start today, we'll probably finish this up on Monday, and then that next quiz will go live and you have it until Wednesday. So you can see, we're kind of going through it quickly. The quizzes, again, are helping you prepare, and they're keeping you, I'd say, keeping you honest for anyone that's not coming here, but watching it online. It's easy to hit play, open up YouTube, and go back to sleep. I know that. I've done it. And then you wake up when you have all of those commercials that are on 200% volume. All right? Yep. No, they haven't. Unfortunately. Yeah, don't forget, I can't post the keys until everyone takes it. So if you don't take it, then I do release it the week of our test. And that'll be released, I think I give the due date Tuesday. You get it done by Tuesday, by that Tuesday night, and then all the keys get released on Wednesday. So you've got Wednesday and Thursday to look through. Questions? Yeah, today's quiz is about origin adaptation, right? 2.2. Yeah. Yeah, so like the handouts and stuff, I have them based on our presentation. So yeah, 2.2 is the origin of adaptations. Yep. Yep. Yeah, so this is actually what would be 3.2. So 3.1 was the introduction, and then what we're going to do, I've got two more, so I've got this presentation next, which is the avoidance strategies. All right, and then we talk about the, more than that. Then we talk about the adaptations, and I've broken those down into adaptations to the thermal environment, adaptations to water stress, and I've split that up into animals response and then plant response. Because with the animals, we also have to contend with salinity when dealing with aquatic organisms. All right, and then I think when we get through those, we're done. We've completed all of the material for the lecture exam, for the first lecture exam. And again, I'll very clearly define it and break it up and say, okay, lecture exam material stops here. Big line in your notes. Exam 2 starts, at this point. So we won't like take an exam where it's like half of this presentation. We get through a presentation, we stop. Any other questions? All right, let's talk about the avoidance strategies, because the avoidance strategies hopefully just kind of make sense a little bit. All right, because what we're dealing with is an environment that changes, and if we can't adapt to it, then our only other option is to try to avoid it. Now, how we go about avoiding it varies based on the organisms that we're injuring, that we're talking about. You could say, well, it's easy for us. It's too hot outside. Let's come inside to the air conditioning. We're mobile. Do you think the pine tree can do that? No, it's stuck. Can't move. All right. So one of the first ways that we can use to avoid harsh conditions is inactivity. So we basically shut ourselves down. We're still in the same place. We're still experiencing it, but because we are completely inactive, it's going to reduce the effect of the environment, or reduce the effect that the environment has on us. All right? So by reducing our activity levels, we would reduce our exposure to that environment. And then once the environmental conditions change and return to normal, then we can become active again. Examples of all these are examples: seeds, spores, pupa or larval types, eggs, etc. Those are all organisms that are completely inactive. All right? And a lot of those stages have evolved to be inactive for exactly this reason, to avoid harsh conditions. All right, so seeds. All right? Oak trees make those acorns. They drop the acorns. Those acorns are inactive. Are they dealing with freezing conditions? Yeah, they do, but they're inactive. They're shut down. There's no metabolic process to worry about to cause them to, freeze. Yeah, you can get the freeze, but again, the cells that are in that seed won't be affected by the freeze, or if they're affected, it's a minimal effect, if at all, if they are affected. All right, so types of inactivity include diapause and torpor. All right, and they are two separate ideas. So torpor actually no. Diapause is developmental arrest. We're growing, and then we just stop growing and hang out. Let's see here. We had a couple people in parasitology, right? Yeah. Yes, I saw one in parasitology. What parasite undergoes developmental arrest? Put you on the spot. Don't remember. Who has a grade change request? Just joking. Just joking. Well, there's probably somebody watching online. Malaria? Ooh. That is good. developmental, that happens for different reasons. But yeah, you're right. Plasmodium undergoes, certain species of Plasmodium will undergo this developmental arrest. Where does it happen? Which cells? Those species maybe be a developmental arrest. That causes, in malaria, there's relapse, and then there's this process called recrudescence. Remember that too? Maybe? So one of them is, it's in the red blood cells. But in Plasmodium, yeah, see, Paula, it's not what I was going for. But malaria goes in, the first cells that they infect are the liver cells. And at that, some species, they get into the liver and they just shut down and they hang out in those liver cells. And then years later, something happens and they get reactivated, and then you have the onset of symptoms again of malaria. Your paroxysms, your fevers, your chills, delirium, and all that stuff. That's one. It's not the one that I was going for, because that process, as a protozoan, a little bit different. But hookworms. Hookworms, right? Remember that? Hookworm life cycle is 1 year. They live about 1 year. That's it. All right? The eggs get shed. They hatch. Juvenile larvae feed on bacteria. They grow. They get to this J3 stage, the third juvenile stage. And then when you're walking across barefoot on the dirt and stuff, that hookworm penetrates into your skin, gets into your bloodstream, and one species that we talk about undergoes developmental arrest. It completely shuts down. Now, you can say, well, our body's fighting it, right? Yeah, it is, but nematode cuticles are pretty resistant to the host immune system. They just hang out there. And then within a set period of time, they reactivate, they finish their migration to get down to the gut, where they then feed on your blood and epithelial cells. So this is developmental arrest. Why would they do developmental arrest? And again, this is a question I asked the parasitology class, because as we're talking about, my internal body conditions are similar to your internal body conditions, are similar to yours. They don't fluctuate. We have homeostatic mechanisms to maintain constant conditions. So why would this undergo developmental arrest? Well, it's not us that it's adapting to, it's the environment. It's the outside environment. Those eggs have to get out, and then your juveniles develop in the soil. This developmental arrest evolved to avoid the dry conditions that develop annually. So they get into our body, they hang out and they wait, and you're on a kind of fixed timeline. It's going to be somewhat of a random timeline if you look throughout the population, but it's hoped that some of them will come out of this developmental arrest, reproduce and shed eggs right at the start of the rainy season. So then the juveniles are in great conditions, they're growing up, and they reinfect more humans, and our life cycle continues. Seeds are the same way. Trees, they produce the seeds. What are they doing? The seeds sit. All right? We get rain. I mean, we had rain. Well, I didn't get rain, but apparently it rained someplace in the city a couple days ago. Right? Those acorns got wet. Why didn't they germinate? Developmental arrest. They're programmed. Stay that way. You've got to get through a period of cold, and then once you get through that period of cold, that's your signal. Environment's about ready to change. Now germination can proceed, and hopefully these seeds germinate and our new tree develops in favorable conditions. All right? So that's diapause. That's a complete developmental arrest. The other one is this torpor, which is where our body really slows its physiological activity down. Doesn't completely stop, but slows it way down to hopefully outlast those harsh conditions. What we'll do is we'll pick up and we'll talk about torpor on Monday. All right, so don't forget about the exam that's due today, and then you'll get a notice from Blackboard that the next quiz goes live, and you'll have through Monday night to take it. The other answer to the attendance is the letter D. A and D. D is in David. All right. Don't forget that attendance quiz. Let us finish this out. All right. If you have questions, email me. You enjoy